The year 1964 stands as a fulcrum point in popular music, though most people who weren't there haven't the faintest idea why. Everyone knows the Beatles were important, sure, but the sanitized narrative we've inherited has stripped away the raw, visceral reality of what actually transpired when John, Paul, George, and Ringo stepped onto Australian soil that winter. The Australia tour wasn't just another stop on their increasingly frenzied world domination circuit. It represented something far more consequential than ticket sales and screaming teenagers, though there was plenty of both. This was the moment when the transformation from skilled beat group to genuine cultural phenomenon crystallized in real time. And if you understand the musical and historical mechanics of what happened during those few weeks in June, you begin to grasp why rock music evolved the way it did. Let's establish something right away. The Beatles, who arrived in Adelaide on June 12, 1964, were not yet the studio wizards who would later craft Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band or Abbey Road. They hadn't yet explored mind-altering substances, backwards tape loops, or Indian classical music. They were still fundamentally a live rock and roll band, though one operating at a level of tightness and musicality that their contemporaries couldn't match. Their set list during the Australian tour drew heavily from their first two albums and the recent singles that were eviscerating chart positions worldwide. I Saw Her Standing There, You Can't Do That, All My Loving, She Loves You, Till There Was You, likely as in the rest of the 1964 world tour. Roll Over Beethoven, Can't Buy Me Love, This Boy, and Long Tall Sally formed the core of performances that rarely exceeded 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Think about that. These shows that people would remember for the rest of their lives, that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Australian popular culture, lasted about as long as a modern television episode minus commercials. The brevity wasn't artistic choice but practical necessity. The sheer decibel level of adolescent hysteria made anything longer both pointless and physically dangerous. But here's what the screaming crowds and subsequent rock mythology have obscured. Those 30-minute sets represented some of the most musically sophisticated popular entertainment available in 1964, executed with a precision that belied the apparent simplicity of the material. As someone who's spent decades studying instrumental technique and arrangement, I can tell you that what the Beatles were doing on those stages was considerably more complex than it appeared. Consider the rhythm section foundation that Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney constructed. Ringo's drumming has been criminally undervalued by people who don't actually play drums. His approach combined rock-solid timekeeping with fills and accents that were genuinely innovative for the period. Listen to how he handles She Loves You, and pay attention to the tom work during the verses. He's not just keeping time, he's creating melodic commentary, using the toms almost like tuned percussion to add harmonic color beneath the vocals. The famous drum break before the final chorus isn't technically complicated by prog rock standards, but its placement and execution demonstrate an instinctive understanding of dynamics and song structure that most drummers twice his age couldn't manage. He understood space and restraint at 23 years old, in ways that session players with decades more experience were still fumbling toward. McCartney's bass playing in this period gets overlooked because his later work became so prominent in the mix and so melodically adventurous that people forget he was already doing something special in 1964. His Hofner violin bass had a distinctive tone, warm and round, that sat perfectly in the mix even in the primitive sound reinforcement systems they were working with. But beyond tone, his note choices showed a harmonic sophistication that came from his early training. Paul had actually studied music more formally than the others, and while he couldn't sight-read complex orchestral scores, he understood voice leading and counterpoint intuitively. During All My Loving, while John and George are locked into that relentless triplet rhythm guitar pattern, Paul's bass line moves in contrary motion, creating a tension and release that gives the song its propulsive energy. This isn't Motown-level bass playing yet, but you can hear him moving in that direction, thinking about the bass as a melodic instrument rather than just the bottom end. The guitar work deserves particular attention because this is where the Beatles were genuinely ahead of their peers. George Harrison at 21 was already a more refined player than he's generally credited for being. His solo on Can't Buy Me Love during the Australian tour shows his Chet Atkins and Carl Perkins influences, filtered through his own sensibility. He's not playing 1,000 notes. He's playing the right notes with impeccable timing and tone. That solo is constructed around the pentatonic scale, sure, but listen to how he approaches and releases the target notes, the slight bends and vibrato that give each phrase personality. This is craftsmanship. The Gretsch country gentleman he was playing had a bright cutting tone that could penetrate even through the screaming, and George had figured out how to make every note count. John Lennon's rhythm guitar work gets ignored because rhythm guitar in general gets ignored, but his contribution to the Beatles' sound was foundational. His Rickenbacker 325, with its short scale and distinctive jangly tone, provided the harmonic and rhythmic glue that held everything together. During I Saw Her Standing There, John's playing drives the song forward with a relentless eighth note pattern that's harder to execute cleanly than it sounds. Keeping that level of rhythmic intensity and consistency for an entire song while singing backing vocals requires serious chops. His rhythm work on You Can't Do That is even more interesting because he's playing what's essentially the lead riff while maintaining the rhythmic foundation. The percussive attack in his playing, the way he digs into the strings, added an aggressive edge that balanced Paul's melodic sensibility. The vocal harmonies the Beatles deployed live were legitimately remarkable. Three-part harmony is difficult under the best circumstances, in a quiet studio with multiple takes available. Executing tight harmonies in front of thousands of screaming fans with minimal monitoring is exponentially harder. Yet night after night during the Australian tour, they nailed the harmonies on songs like This Boy, with a precision that professional vocal groups spending their entire careers on harmony work would envy. The blend between John's raw, slightly nasal lead, Paul's melodic middle voice, and George's higher harmonies created a texture that was instantly recognizable and emotionally compelling. This Boy particularly showcased their vocal abilities because it's essentially a doo-wop number, heavily dependent on the harmonies for its impact. The bridge features John's lead vocal against sustained harmonies from Paul and George, and the way they voiced those chords showed a sophisticated understanding of harmony that went beyond simple thirds and fifths. But let's step back from the purely technical analysis for a moment and consider the context in which all this was happening. Australia in 1964 was not the cosmopolitan, culturally diverse nation it would become. The country was still operating under the White Australia policy. Popular music meant either local acts doing pale imitations of American and British styles, or actual American and British artists on occasional tours. Australian teenagers had access to radio and records, so they knew who the Beatles were before the band arrived, but experiencing them live was something else entirely. The closest cultural comparison might be a religious revival meeting, except instead of salvation, what was on offer was liberation from the suffocating conformity of early 1960s Australian suburban life. The tour was punishing. 20 shows in 6 nights, 4 in Adelaide, 6 in Melbourne, 8 in Sydney, 2 in Brisbane. The venues ranged from proper concert halls to outdoor stadiums. Centennial Hall at the Adelaide Showgrounds, Festival Hall and Melbourne Town Hall in Melbourne, Sydney Stadium in Sydney. The acoustics varied from barely adequate to outright terrible. The sound systems were primitive by any standard. The Beatles couldn't hear themselves properly. The audiences couldn't hear the band over their own screaming. By any reasonable measure, these should have been disasters. Yet they weren't. Something transcendent was happening that went beyond the merely musical. This is where we need to talk honestly about what Beatlemania actually meant, stripped of the nostalgic gloss and cultural studies jargon. Those weren't just fans screaming. Those were young people, primarily young women, experiencing something that their society had not prepared them for and actively discouraged. Sexual awakening, certainly, though reducing it purely to sex misses the point. What the Beatles represented was possibility. The possibility that life could be more than what your parents and teachers and clergy insisted it had to be. The possibility that joy and excitement and abandon weren't sinful or childish, but actually the point of being alive. The possibility that 4 guys from nowhere special could conquer the world through talent and charisma and sheer bloody-mindedness. The Australian media didn't know what to make of it. The newspapers alternated between breathless coverage of the band's every move and stern editorials condemning the hysteria and warning about the degradation of youth culture. Television news showed the crowds and the chaos, often with barely concealed disapproval. The establishment was genuinely frightened by what they were witnessing, and they should have been, because the social order they were invested in maintaining was being cheerfully dynamited by four musicians who couldn't have articulated any coherent political philosophy, but whose very existence was revolutionary. Now, as someone who came to the Beatles through progressive rock and worked backward, I initially shared the prejudice many prog fans have toward early Beatles material. The songs are simple. The structures are basic verse-chorus, middle 8-chorus patterns. The lyrics are often trite. She loves you, yeah, isn't exactly the musical box or close to the edge. But spending time with these recordings and understanding what was actually happening musically and culturally forced me to revise that judgment. Complexity for its own sake is masturbation. What matters is whether the music achieves its intended effect, and the music the Beatles were playing in Australia in 1964 was achieving effects that complexity couldn't touch. The song selection during the Australian tour reflected where the Beatles were in their artistic development. They were still performing covers alongside their original material. Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven, which George sang, gave them rock and roll credibility and let George showcase his vocal abilities. The song choice was perfect for their purposes because it literally announces that a new musical order is replacing the old one. Whether the Beatles or their audiences caught the irony that the song itself was already nearly a decade old and represented the previous generation's revolution is unclear, but the message still resonated. Little Richard's Long Tall Sally let Paul demonstrate his vocal power and raw energy. When Paul tears into that song, all sweet melodicism vanishes, replaced by pure screaming rock and roll fury. It's cathartic and slightly dangerous, a reminder that beneath the mop tops and suits there were still edgy rock and rollers. The original material they were performing showed the rapid evolution of their songwriting. I Saw Her Standing There, from their debut album, is a straightforward rocker, but listen to the structure. The bass intro immediately grabs attention. The harmony vocals on O before each chorus add sophistication. The middle 8 modulates to a new key and features a call and response vocal pattern that builds tension before releasing back into the chorus. For a song about seeing a girl at a dance, it's remarkably well constructed. All My Loving demonstrates Paul's gift for melody. The verse melody is genuinely beautiful, with unexpected intervals and a flowing conversational quality. The triplet guitar pattern that drives the song forward creates urgency and motion. The bridge doesn't modulate, but shifts to a IV-IV progression that provides harmonic variety. She Loves You deserves special attention because it was their biggest hit to that point and represents a genuine breakthrough in pop songwriting. The opening is the chorus, which immediately gives you the hook. The verse melody is strong enough to stand on its own. The yeah backing vocals are simple but incredibly effective, providing rhythmic punctuation and making the song participatory. Everyone can sing along with yeah, but the sophisticated touch is the use of a 6th chord, an A major with an added 6th at the end of You Know You Should Be Glad. That chord shouldn't work as a resolution, but it does, giving the song a distinctive harmonic flavor that set it apart from every other pop song on the radio. John and Paul wrote that when they were 22 and 21 years old respectively. Can't Buy Me Love shows them moving toward a harder sound. The guitar tone is more aggressive. The vocal delivery is more forceful. The lyrics, while still simple, gesture toward something more thoughtful than simple love songs. Money Can't Buy Love became a recurring theme in their work, perhaps because they were rapidly acquiring money and discovering its limitations. You Can't Do That is even more interesting musically. The main riff, played in parallel thirds on guitar, creates the song's identity. The verse uses a I-fu progression but with added tensions that make it grittier than typical pop. John's vocal performance is aggressive, almost threatening, taking the jealousy theme seriously rather than playing it for sympathy. This Boy was a B-side that became a showcase for their vocal abilities. It's unabashedly a doo-wop ballad, complete with "This Boy Wants You Back Again" lyrics that wouldn't be out of place in a 1950s vocal group's repertoire. But the execution elevates the material. The harmonies are rich and complex. The bridge features John's vocal at its most raw and emotional, a genuine cry of pain that cuts through the sweet harmonies. The structure is ABBA, classic Tin Pan Alley form, but they make it work through sheer vocal commitment. Songs like this in their live set showed audiences that they weren't just a rock and roll band. They had range and versatility. The impact of the Australian tour on the country's music scene was immediate and lasting. Before the Beatles, Australian rock and roll was derivative and tentative. After the Beatles, every teenager with a guitar wanted to form a band. The Easy Beats, the Master's Apprentices, Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, and countless others formed in the wake of the tour, inspired by what they'd witnessed. The idea that Australians could make legitimate rock music, could be more than pale imitators, took hold. This wasn't just cultural imperialism, British musicians showing the colonials how it's done. The Beatles themselves were drawing heavily on American blues and rock and roll, creating a feedback loop where American music filtered through Liverpool came back transformed, inspiring new transformations. Let's talk about the business side briefly, because it's relevant to understanding what was happening. The tour was promoted by Ken Brodziak and Harry Miller, Australian promoters who recognized the commercial potential and were willing to put up serious money to bring the Beatles out. The ticket prices were significant for the time, but they sold out instantly. The band was traveling on a different scale than they had before, with a larger entourage and more elaborate logistics. They were staying in the best hotels, though they were essentially prisoners in their rooms, unable to venture out without causing riots. The commercial success of the Australian tour demonstrated that the Beatles weren't a flash-in-the-pan phenomenon, but a genuine money-making machine with global reach. This had implications for how the music industry would operate going forward, establishing the template for the arena rock tours that would dominate the 1970s and beyond. The media coverage of the tour was saturation level. Every newspaper, every television news broadcast, every radio station covered the Beatles' arrival and activities. Interviews, press conferences, footage of the crowds, opinion pieces, all of it contributed to a media frenzy that amplified the band's impact. The Beatles themselves were media savvy beyond their years, giving good quotes, being charming and funny in press conferences, understanding instinctively how to work the system. John's wit was particularly sharp, deflecting stupid questions with humor that was just edgy enough to be interesting, without being offensive enough to create real problems. Paul was charming and diplomatic. George was the quiet one, which worked as part of the group dynamic. Ringo was funny and self-deprecating. Together, they presented a package that was commercially appealing while still retaining enough rough edges to seem authentic. The question of authenticity is worth examining, because it gets to the heart of what made the Beatles special. They were a manufactured pop group in the sense that Brian Epstein cleaned up their image, put them in suits, insisted on professional behavior. The savage rock and rollers who'd played marathon sets in Hamburg strip clubs were repackaged for mass consumption. Yet somehow, the essential core of who they were survived the packaging. You could see it in their performances, the way they moved on stage, the looks they exchanged, the genuine pleasure they seemed to take in the music they were making. This wasn't a boy band assembled by executives from separate auditions. This was an actual band, guys who'd played together for years, who understood each other musically and personally, who had chemistry that couldn't be faked. During the Australian tour, that chemistry was on full display despite the difficult performing conditions. Watch footage from the concerts, and you see them cueing each other, locking in rhythmically, responding to each other's energy. They're not just executing a rehearsed set list, they're playing music together in real time, adjusting tempos, extending or shortening songs based on the crowd response, making decisions on the fly. This requires a level of musical communication that only comes from extensive shared experience. When Paul and John lean into the same microphone for harmonies, they're not just hitting the right notes. They're blending their voices in a way that requires them to listen to each other, to adjust pitch and tone to create the unified sound. That's musicianship, not just celebrity. The set list during the Australian tour was reasonably consistent from show to show, but there were variations. Sometimes they'd add or drop a song depending on time constraints or how they were feeling. This flexibility is important because it meant the shows weren't completely mechanical repetitions. Each performance was a unique event, influenced by that particular audience in that particular venue on that particular night. The energy in Festival Hall Melbourne on a Tuesday would be different from the energy in Sydney Stadium on a Saturday, and the Beatles responded to those differences. This improvisational element, even within the tight constraints of 30-minute sets of well-rehearsed material, kept the performances vital and prevented them from becoming rote. The technical limitations they were working under are difficult to overstate. The amplification systems available in 1964 were laughably inadequate for the venues they were playing. Vox AC30 amplifiers, which sound glorious in a club or studio, were hopelessly underpowered for stadiums. The public address systems in these venues were designed for announcements, not rock bands. There was no sophisticated monitor system feeding sound back to the band so they could hear themselves. They were largely playing from muscle memory and visual cues, unable to hear the vocals or often even the instruments clearly. This is why their timing and tightness were so crucial. If you can't hear properly, you have to rely on your internalized sense of the music and your peripheral awareness of what your bandmates are doing. Lesser bands would have fallen apart under those conditions. The Beatles adapted and persevered. The physical toll of the tour was significant. Playing multiple shows a day, traveling between cities, dealing with the constant press attention, the lack of sleep, the inability to move freely, all of it added up. They were young men in their early 20s, which helped. But even so, exhaustion was a constant factor. You can see it in photographs from later in the tour, the tiredness in their faces. Yet they continued to deliver performances that satisfied audiences and maintained their professional standards. This work ethic, instilled partly by their Hamburg days when they'd play 6-hour sets, partly by Brian Epstein's insistence on professionalism, served them well. They understood that reputation mattered, and that every performance reflected on their future prospects. The Australian tour also needs to be understood in the context of the Beatles' development as artists and individuals. They were at a transitional point, no longer the scrappy club band, but not yet the studio auteurs they'd become. They were experiencing fame and wealth on a scale unprecedented for musicians of their generation, and they were still figuring out what that meant and how to handle it. Australia was far enough from home and different enough culturally that it must have felt slightly surreal. They were conquering a continent on the opposite side of the world from Liverpool, proof that their appeal transcended geography and culture. This had to be gratifying but also perhaps unsettling. Where did you go after worldwide domination? How did you top this? The answer, though they didn't know it yet in June 1964, was to stop trying to top it in terms of spectacle and instead go deeper musically. The touring life was already becoming untenable. The screaming made it impossible for them to hear themselves improve as musicians. The constant travel was exhausting. The performances, however tight, were becoming repetitive. Within 2 years, they'd stop touring entirely and retreat to the recording studio, where they'd create music that redefined what popular music could be. But the touring years, including the Australian tour, were essential to their development. They learned stagecraft and audience connection, and how to function as a unit under pressure. Those lessons informed everything that came after. From a progressive rock perspective, it's tempting to dismiss the early Beatles as too simple, too commercial, too far from the extended instrumental passages and conceptual ambition that would define prog. But prog rock itself emerged from what the Beatles and their contemporaries were doing in the mid-1960s. The idea that rock music could be artistically ambitious, could incorporate influences from classical music and jazz and experimental composition, could be taken seriously as art rather than just entertainment, that idea didn't spring fully formed from nowhere. It developed gradually, and the Beatles were central to that development. Their decision to stop touring and focus on studio experimentation gave permission for other bands to do the same. Their incorporation of orchestral instruments, unconventional song structures, studio effects, backwards tape loops, All of it helped create the environment in which progressive rock could emerge. But even in 1964, even in the supposedly simple early material, you can hear the seeds of what was coming. The harmonic sophistication in She Loves You. The structural variations in songs like I'll Be Back or Things We Said Today, which they were writing around the time of the Australian tour, even if they weren't performing them yet. The willingness to experiment with different vocal approaches and instrumental textures. They were learning and growing at an accelerated rate, absorbing influences and synthesizing them into something new. The Australian tour represented a peak of their development as a live performing unit, the moment when they were as tight and energetic and effective as a traditional rock and roll band could be. After this, they'd move in new directions, but this foundation was essential. Let's consider the broader cultural impact of the tour beyond just music. The Beatles in Australia represented modernity, youth culture, internationalism, all the forces that were beginning to reshape the world in the 1960s. Australia was still relatively isolated culturally, still tied closely to Britain as part of the Commonwealth, still conservative and inward-looking in many ways. The Beatles were a blast of fresh air, a suggestion that the world was bigger and more exciting than what provincial Australian life offered. For teenagers in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane, the Beatles represented an alternative to the prescribed path of school, job, marriage, suburban house, respectability. Maybe you could be an artist. Maybe you could travel the world. Maybe you could refuse to conform and still succeed. Maybe even succeed because you refuse to conform. This message was particularly powerful for young women, though it's often overlooked. The majority of the screaming fans at Beatles concerts were female, and this was treated as evidence of their shallowness, their susceptibility to marketing, their inability to appreciate music seriously. That's nonsense. Those young women were responding to something real, to a freedom and intensity that their lives lacked. They were told to be quiet, demure, obedient, to prepare for supporting roles as wives and mothers. The Beatles offered a different script, not explicitly but implicitly through their very existence. The screaming was many things, but part of it was claiming space, making noise, demanding attention, refusing to be quiet and demure. It was a form of rebellion, perhaps inchoate and not politically articulated, but rebellion nonetheless. The young men at the concerts, fewer in number but present, were having their own revelations. Before the Beatles, masculinity in rock and roll often meant Elvis-style sexual threat or tough guy posturing. The Beatles offered something different: wit, camaraderie, a certain vulnerability alongside the confidence. You could have long hair and wear suits and be cheeky and clever and still be masculine. This expanded the range of acceptable male behavior in subtle but significant ways. The impact shouldn't be overstated. They weren't gender theorists, they were entertainers. But neither should it be dismissed. Cultural change happens through multiple channels, and popular music is a powerful one. The Australian tour also highlighted the Beatles' relationship with race and racial politics in ways worth examining honestly. Rock and roll was black music repackaged for white audiences, and the Beatles were white British guys making money from music forms invented by black Americans. They were always forthright about their influences, crediting Chuck Berry and Little Richard and the Motown artists whose work they covered and admired. They refused to play segregated venues in the American South, which was a significant stance for the time. But they also benefited from a system that made it easier for white artists to achieve commercial success than black artists creating the same or better music. This tension is inherent in rock history and can't be resolved by good intentions or proper credits. It just has to be acknowledged as part of the context. In Australia specifically, the racial politics were complicated by the country's treatment of Aboriginal people and its immigration restrictions. The Beatles themselves likely weren't thinking deeply about these issues. They were young musicians focused on their careers, not political activists. But their success, their message of youth and modernity and breaking with tradition, did contribute to a climate that would eventually challenge some of Australia's more retrograde social policies. The connections are indirect, and it's important not to credit the Beatles with political changes they didn't directly cause. But culture and politics, are intertwined in complex ways. The musical legacy of the Australian tour is clearer and more direct. The generation of Australian musicians who saw the Beatles in 1964 absorbed lessons that shaped their own careers. The importance of tight harmonies, professional presentation, strong original material, energetic performance, all of these became standards that Australian bands aspired to. The Easy Beats, who'd form later in 1964, were directly inspired by the Beatles' visit. They'd go on to international success with Friday on My Mind, a song that showed Beatles-level craftsmanship in its construction. Other Australian bands followed, creating a vibrant local scene that produced internationally recognized artists. None of this would have happened exactly the way it did without the Beatles tour demonstrating what was possible. For the Beatles themselves, the Australian tour was validation on a global scale. They'd conquered Britain and America. Australia proved they could conquer anywhere. The confidence this gave them can't be measured but surely mattered. They knew they were the best at what they did. They knew they could write songs that connected with people across different cultures and continents. This confidence would be necessary for the artistic risks they'd take in subsequent years. If they'd experienced failure or indifference in Australia, if the tour had been a commercial or artistic disappointment, it might have affected their trajectory. Instead, the overwhelming success reinforced that they were on the right path and gave them the security to experiment. The technical aspects of the Australian performances deserve one more examination from an instrumentalist's perspective. Ringo's drum kit was basic by today's standards: bass drum, snare, a couple of toms, hi-hat, a couple of cymbals. No double bass drums, no walls of toms, no elaborate setups. Yet he created a signature sound that's instantly recognizable. The snare had a distinctive crack, tuned higher than most rock drummers were using. His cymbal work was sparse but effective, using the ride for patterns and the crashes for accents. The simplicity of his setup forced him to be creative with what he had, to make every hit count. Modern drummers with elaborate kits could learn from his economy and musicality. Paul's Hofner bass, as mentioned, had a unique tone, but his technique was equally important. He used a pick sometimes and fingers other times, depending on the song and the sound he wanted. His right-hand attack varied from aggressive to gentle, controlling dynamics and articulation. His left-hand fingering was efficient, moving smoothly through positions without wasted motion. He wasn't a flashy player, no slapping, no tapping, no extended solo passages, but his sense of groove and melody made the bass an integral part of every song rather than just the bottom end. Bassists should study his work from this period to understand how to serve the song rather than show off. George's guitar work combined rhythm and lead playing, and his right-hand technique was particularly noteworthy. He used a pick with a light, precise touch, getting clear articulation on every note. His vibrato was controlled, usually a slow, wide vibrato that came from finger movement rather than wrist shaking. His bends were accurate, hitting the target pitch precisely. These are fundamental techniques but executed at a high level. His solo on "You Can't Do That" uses hammer-ons and pull-offs to create fluid lines without requiring superhuman picking speed. Efficiency and musicality over technical flash. John's rhythm playing was all about the right hand, the attack and consistency of his strumming. He hit the strings hard, creating a percussive quality that added to the rhythmic drive. His left-hand chord voicings were often simple. Basic major and minor chords, dominant sevenths, the occasional sixth, but placed in the right register to sit in the mix properly. He understood that rhythm guitar was about creating a cushion of sound for the vocals and lead guitar to sit on, and he fulfilled that role with professionalism and consistency. The vocal microphone technique all four Beatles displayed was more sophisticated than it might appear. Singing into a microphone properly requires understanding proximity effect, managing plosive sounds, controlling breath, maintaining consistent distance. In a live setting with minimal sound reinforcement and terrible monitoring, these skills became even more critical. They'd learned through thousands of hours of performance in Liverpool and Hamburg clubs how to work a microphone, and those skills served them well in the much larger Australian venues. John and Paul particularly, sharing a single microphone for harmonies, had to have perfect spatial awareness and balance to avoid one voice overwhelming the other. The conclusion of the Australian tour in late June 1964 marked the end of a particular phase of the Beatles' career. They'd return to Britain, continue touring, record more albums, conquer America repeatedly. But the innocence and simplicity of the early touring years was already fading. The pressures and contradictions of fame were becoming apparent. The artistic ambitions that would lead them away from live performance and toward studio experimentation were forming. Australia got the Beatles at a peak moment, when they were still primarily a live band, still relatively unspoiled by success, still hungry and excited about what they were doing. Looking back more than half a century later, the Australian tour of 1964 stands as a crystallization of what made the Beatles special. Exceptional musical ability deployed in service of strong material, performed with energy and commitment, connecting with audiences on a visceral level that transcended the merely musical to become cultural phenomenon. They weren't just entertaining people. They were offering a glimpse of what life could be if you refused to accept limitations. If you believed that four guys from nowhere could change the world through music and personality, and refusing to accept no for an answer.